All right, so let's take a look at how to handle blank values. As I mentioned in class, blank values in database management are handled differently than you might expect. So here we have someone without a last name. It seems strange to be able to record someone without a last name, and most likely the missing data will be on something besides the name, but that's what we're working with, so let's take a look. The question is, how should we go ahead and record this? And so right now, this is just a zero-length string as far as Excel is concerned, and Excel is more than happy to keep that as a zero-length string. But in the world of database, that's going to be a problem. So let's just see what happens if we use our existing algorithm to be able to handle that blank value. So I'm going to put a breakpoint right here just before we execute. And we'll run it to there. We're on the second line, so it'll take us a couple times through to get there. So I'll execute this code. So first time through, we've printed the first one, and now here's the second one. So here's the problem, is that it's just showing this for last name as a zero-length string. We've got Ricky with no last name showing quote, quote. The problem is that the way that we say there is no value in database lingo is not with a zero-length string. What we have to do is we have to get this to say the reserved word in structured query language, NULL. Null says that there is no value. Alternatively, we could execute the statement like this. We could build the statement to just say, well, don't insert last name at all, just insert first name. And this will produce, if we execute these two lines, this will produce exactly the same result. It will create a record that has a value for first name of Ricky and has no value for last name. And so building the insert statement using either of these approaches is fine. I think the code ends up being simpler if we take this approach. If we say, listen, what we're going to do is we're going to replace our template value either with the value from the database or with null. So let's just do that. We'll do that here on last name. So I'm just going to put an if statement around this where we're adapting the structured query language. If the value that we're getting ready to plug in, that we're looking at in that column, if that value is equal to a zero-length string, we do one thing. Else, we behave like normal. So, we'll just go ahead and bring this same line up and modify it. And instead of replacing it with, see, we won't need to worry about the quotes because there's no quotes on null. So the replace here deals with the single quote, converting it to double quotes. So I'm just going to replace that with null. And we'll see a different problem here, but we're getting closer. So let me go ahead and run this. Here's the first one. We don't need the first one. And then run one more time, we'll get the new version. So now we've got insert into first name, last name, Ricky, and we've got null here, but the trouble is that null is in single quotes. And whenever we put single quotes around anything, right, that tells the Oracle query or the structured query language parser not to try to figure out what this means, just put in these characters. And so it makes it into a string literal. And so we've got to get rid of those quotes when we do null, so it's the null reserved word rather than someone whose last name happens to be null. And so what we're going to do here is that on the one where we're dealing with null, instead of just replacing the tag, we're also going to replace the single quotes that surround the tag. So I'm going to put a single quote there, and I'll put a single quote here. So now, instead of just replacing ln with null, we're going to replace quote ln quote with null. And we're going to do that on the condition when we're looking at a blank value for the value that we're trying to, would normally expect to add into the database. So let's go ahead and give that one a shot. We'll run this again. There's row number 2 that we're not worried about. Let's go ahead and get to row number 3. And so now we've got it without the quotes, and that should execute just fine and plug in that statement. Let's go ahead and take a look in access, and we'll sort this. Should be the one at the very bottom. And so now here's Ricky with no value. Up here we have Ricky with a zero-length string. So let's just see that, in fact, if we were to write a query in access, we would pull those two records differently. We've got through row 318 and 324. So let me just go ahead and create a query in design view and customer table. Want everything from customer, and we'll do this where the last name, a little more room here. The criteria is a zero-length string, quote, quote. I think we can do that here, equals, quote, quote. I'll run that, and that brings up 318 only. If we come back and change that to the keyword null, then access even changed that to is null. We'll run that, and oh, look at that, we get both of them. How interesting. So one of them is a zero-length string, but access is still bringing it back as if it's null. And but a 324 is the one that actually has the keyword null. So that's access trying to help us out. And again, if we have equals quote quote here, it'll only bring one of them. So that's just a little bit about dealing with null, and we'll definitely want to take this approach. Because in this case, even though access is sort of treating that zero-length string like a null, it's responding to an is null. That's a quirk of access and not normal for most database management systems. And so this is the trick that we'll need to do to be able to make sure that we get null into the query rather than a zero-length string. And of course, based on our data, whatever the data might be, we should probably do that for every field that could possibly be null in the data. So depending on what we know about the data, if it's possible that the first name might end up being null, then we would want to do the same thing for this as well. So I'll just go ahead and plug that in real quick. If our first name is equal to a zero-length string, then that's what we might even want to do, is we might want to trim this. So remember, trim will take off leading and trailing spaces. So if it's just spaces, we probably don't want to include anything in there. So trimming that down will say, hey, if you got a leading space or trailing space, go ahead and get that off and check that for null. Check to see if it's a zero-length string. Okay, so if it's blank, we want to convert that to null. Change this to null. So it seems strange that we're putting it in quotes here. And null, just like this, is a valid VBA statement as well. Again, it means the absence of a value. But we actually have to build a string that holds the query. And so we need to put in, as far as VBA is concerned, a string version of null without quotes. So we'll replace the quotes in our template query so that it can end up being the reserved word in this for access to parse. And so this is one approach, and there are multiple ways that we can think about how to build that query. Even if I'm using null, there's different ways to get the null in there. But this is a pretty clean one for us to work with. And let's just go ahead and make sure that it executes. Make sure I've typed everything correctly. That should lay in all the data again. Looks good. All right.